All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Yael Gordon, and I am the president of the Louisiana chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. And I have with me here my wonderful sister, Ms. Gaynell Brady, who is my vice president of the AAHGS chapter here in Louisiana, and she's going to provide you a wonderful presentation tonight about the Holt Cemetery. So feel free to use the chat box to ask any questions that you may have. I would do ask a few, one simple housekeeping. If everyone can please mute your phones so we won't have any background interference with any of the noise. And put the questions in the chat. And if she decides to take the live questions, we'll ask those persons to unmute themselves in order to proceed. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Gaynell at this time.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Yael, for having me here. Feels kind of weird. Like, we always talk on the phone to have you, like, introduce me. I'm like, wait, this is real formal. But, yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to bring this presentation to the chapter. Really means a lot to me to be able to talk about cemeteries, especially since you and I spend a lot of time talking about cemeteries and how we as genealogists need to do more to preserve our places where our ancestors are buried. So it's one thing to constantly like research them, but not really talk about the places where their final resting places. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. So as I do with all of my presentations, I'm always thinking of my ancestors first. And I wanted to dedicate this presentation to my grandma, Florence Jefferson Willett, who was from Clinton, Louisiana, and she died here in New Orleans. And she's buried in the Holt Cemetery. She has been on my mind really since I started this project. And so especially over the past 2 to 3 weeks, she has really been like every day I think about her. And I'm sharing her stories with so many other people. And it wasn't, I think, until like maybe a week or so ago, I realized she actually died this month in 1957. So this presentation is also dedicated to my other 13 family members who are all buried in Holt Cemetery. And I want to take this moment to acknowledge them. And I also would like to encourage you in the chat box, if any of your ancestors is like on your mind or on your heart and have been like really bugging you, keeping you up at night, doing research, I would like you to take this time to dedicate your participation to them by typing their name in a chat box, because we want to remember them as much as we can and often talk to them and talk about them so that their memories can live on in our work and everything that we do. So, Yael, if you can see the chat, I can't see them. If you can recite some of those names as people type them, it would mean a lot to me.
Yes, we're still waiting on for the persons to type in the information. Again, if you have any ancestors whose names you would like to present, please type their names into the chat box so we can recite them to give them the honor that they rightfully deserve.
Hey, I actually just received, Cheryl Jefferson. Wow. Wow. Okay. And then my husband actually, he overheard me and he wanted to remember his best friend who's also buried there, Kenneth Prudhomme, who died in the early 1990s. And he's also buried in the Holt Cemetery. Also want to think about the Hine family, who has a large section in the Holt Cemetery, and many other family members who are buried at the cemetery. So again, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to get into the presentation. So tonight's objectives, I want to just do a quick Cemetery 101, covering the types of cemeteries and definitions, also the history of Holt, and trying to debunk some of the myths, just kind of like put some things on the table. And then I'm going to talk about genealogy research at Holt Cemetery and also resources that are available at the New Orleans Public Library. I also want to invite you all to participate in upcoming public forums that we will have that's talking about a big preservation project at Holt Cemetery. So as genealogists, I would love to have you all to sign up to participate, and I'll include information about that at the end of this presentation. So the first type of cemetery that I want to talk about is churchyards, just defining it in terms of what it is and where it's located. So churchyard cemeteries are buried on, or sites that are burials that took place on the church grounds. They're usually adjacent to the church. So this is St. Mark's Church and Cemetery is actually located on Glenwood Plantation, and the sites that you see here are actually my ancestors who are buried on the plantation grounds. So that's your churchyard cemeteries. The next kind of cemeteries are church-owned cemeteries. These are cemeteries that are actually owned by the church, but not adjacent to the church or on the church grounds. Example of that would be St. Patrick's Cemetery in New Orleans, Louisiana. The next one is family cemeteries. You all may know those. They're located on the land owned by family members, and it's dedicated land, kind of usually off to the back or off to another section in the cemetery, and it's dedicated land specifically for burials that's on the family-owned property. The next one is private-owned cemeteries, those cemeteries that are owned by a corporation, so like a large company, that's their nature of business, where they have cemeteries where people pay to be buried there. So an example of that would be Metairie Park Cemetery in New Orleans. And then the last one, the last type of cemetery is government-owned cemetery. So those that are owned and managed by the parish, the town, or national government agencies. So like your national cemeteries like Chalmette National Cemetery, or in the case of this presentation, Holt Cemetery. And just so that we could get some common definitions on the ground so that you'll know what I'm speaking of when I'm talking in reference to this presentation. So when I say marker, I'm speaking of a memorial which identifies the burial plot. Determines just the permanent disposition of remains of a deceased human. When I say free land burials, I'm speaking of burials on land to which no title is held. And then indigent also, it means those who can't afford to pay for a burial or whose identity may be unknown. Those are like your the burials when people may not go pick them up, or if they die somewhere we don't know who the relatives are. And then potter's field. So a lot of people refer to Holt as a potter's field. And at one point in time, it was the burial grounds for indigent, paupers, and unknown persons. Coroner burials are just burials of paupers and unmarked graves. And at one point in time, Holt Cemetery did both of these. So now I'm going to dive into a little bit of the history of Holt. So you're going to see this image in the background showing up more than once. This is actually the area in which, like, one of my favorite ancestors, Belle Jefferson, is actually buried there along with her husband, and then one of my cousins, Joseph Farrell. They're all in this one little section. So this is like one of my favorite photos, and when I see it, it just reminds me of why this place is so important. So in 1879, Dr. Joseph Holt reported that the Locust Grove Cemetery in New Orleans was overcrowded. And this primarily happened because of the yellow fever epidemic of 1878. So if you're familiar with the yellow fever epidemic, you would know that a lot of people died and a lot of our cemeteries were overcrowded. So at this point, the city ordered Locust Grove number 1 and 2 to be closed. At the same time, right around March of 1879, there were some plans for a new cemetery for the burial of paupers to replace Locust Grove numbers 1 and 2. And it also is believed that this cemetery would be named in honor of Dr. Joseph Holt, who was the father of the quarantine. He did a lot of work with the yellow fever epidemic. And also Dr. Holt was a city board health official. So on April 9th, 1879, the mayor of New Orleans approved an ordinance to authorize the administrator of the police, and it's kind of weird to have a cemetery under the administrator of police, but that's what happened in 1879. And the mayor just kind of like ordered the police, the administrative police, to lay off a lot for Holt Cemetery at the lower end of City Park, near the corner of Metairie Road and St. Louis, which is now General Diaz Street. By 1893, they realized that, hey, if we're going to have this cemetery, we're probably going to need someone to actually be the caretaker of this cemetery. So the Commissioner of Police and Public Building hired a sexton to take care of the cemetery at a salary of about $50 a month. So it's at this time that, you can see that the city is trying to find a way to account for all of these burials that kept taking place at Holt. So one of the things I forgot to mention is that Holt Cemetery, all of the burials that take place at Holt, they're all done in the ground. And if you're familiar with New Orleans geography, I can tell you that can be very challenging, because after you dig down so many feet, you're going to run into water. The water table at the New Orleans Holt Cemetery is very high. So whenever you bury bodies in a cemetery, the grave diggers are actually dealing with a lot of water, especially after a rainy day. So you can just imagine at this time of the yellow fever epidemic and every other thing that's happening around the 1890s, this is very challenging even for the sexton who was working at the cemetery at this time. So again, the early 1900s, as I just mentioned, we're dealing with another yellow fever epidemic. And then also we have World War I happening. Again, so as people are returning home, needing a place to be buried, these things are taking place at Holt Cemetery. So as you can probably tell what's going to happen next, the cemetery got overcrowded. So in March 17th, 1906, the city council passed the ordinance to try to build a new Holt Cemetery that was like 300 feet by 450 feet along Monroe Street in New Orleans. But this cemetery was never built. I don't quite remember why it was never built, but it was never built. So you still have burials taking place at Holt from 1879 through these epidemics and now a war. And all of these bodies are just being placed on top of another body. So, of course, by the 1921, you have congestion at Holt Cemetery. So one thing I want to do is just take a moment so that guys can understand where this cemetery is located. It's just a few miles away from New Orleans French Quarter. There are a lot of other cemeteries in the area, but Holt is primarily like a cemetery that will be used by people at this time who just needed a place to be buried. All of our cemeteries were being overcrowded due to various issues. And in the Holt Cemetery, family members would pay the city a very small amount of money to have their relatives and loved ones buried there. And the family members are told at that time that they have to take care of the grave sites and maintain the grave sites in order to keep the grave sites, because Holt Cemetery is one of those cemeteries where it's like free land. There's no, like, they don't own the land. They just have use of that land. So if you're not taking care of your ancestors' burials, then chances are, you know, like I said, the water table is very high, so the headstones could sink in the ground. They could be broken. A lot of things can happen, and so you're still going to have these burials taking place on top of what would have been your grandmother's or great-grandfather's grave. Burials continue at Hope through the 1920s. So at this time, Pastor Hatt from First Mission Baptist Church was like, we need some relief. This cemetery is extremely overcrowded. We have burials taking place on top of burials, and we need some help. We need a new cemetery. So even though Pastor Hatt argued for this, burials continue to happen at Holt. In fact, I want you guys to take a moment to look at this World War I veteran, George Kelly, who was buried there at 24 years old. He was actually buried at Holt Cemetery. So for all of you genealogists, if you need like a rabbit hole to climb through tonight, this is actually a good case. So George Kelly was 24 years old, colored disabled soldier. He returned from France and died Wednesday at the Marine Hospital. It said that it was with some difficulty any trace of his people was found, but authorities get in touch with Mrs. L. Ross, the head of the colored branch of the Red Cross, were able to get information concerning him. He was buried Thursday at Holt Cemetery with Reverend A. Simmons officiating. J.M. Hilburn, a Spanish War veteran, and burglar blew taps over the body. So it was just interesting, even though Pastor Hatt was just saying that, hey, Holt is overcrowded, and now we have this veteran who is here in New Orleans, who was disabled in the hospital, and then now he's buried at the Holt Cemetery, along with so many other military veterans. So by the time you hit to the 1960s and 1990s, the city did make some changes. They ceased coroner burials at Holt Cemetery, okay? So it's at this point that Holt Cemetery stopped being a potter's field. It's at this time that the city, in 1967, the city set aside a piece of land near the rear of another cemetery in New Orleans East for the burial of unclaimed and unidentified bodies. So when these coroner burials take place at the Rest Haven cemeteries, they're in unmarked graves. So by 1986, H. Hirschberg and Associates completed a review of Holt Cemetery. And their recommendations for the cemetery would include excavating and filling graves and renovating Holt into some type of garden-style cemetery and constructing mausoleums there. So it would look completely different. So that was Hirschberg's recommendations in 1986. So by the time we hit the 1990s, the mayor of New Orleans created a task force committee to kind of like address all of the city's cemeteries. And their recommendations for Holt included increasing the burial fees, increasing the number of staff members, and just stop burials in the 1990s at Holt. And then also they also recommended building a new cemetery near Dillard University. So I'll tell you that basically that new cemetery did not happen near Dillard University. Just recently, the burial fees were increased, but there's primarily Holt Cemetery, and just the cemetery division at the cemetery is not a huge division. They do not have like 5, 10, 15, 20 people working at the cemetery to run the cemetery office. In fact, when you call the cemetery office, you're probably going to speak to 1 or 2 persons. And that can be overwhelming for a cemetery that's still receiving about an average of 5 burials per week. I'm sorry. So this is at present, Holt Cemetery is one of 7 cemeteries owned by the city of New Orleans, including St. Mary's Cemetery, which is known as Carrollton No. 2, Green Street Cemetery, which is known as Carrollton No. 1, Lafayette No. 1, Lafayette No. 3, I may have that wrong, and Bella Street Cemetery, Holt, and then the Indigenous Cemetery that I mentioned in New Orleans East. So Holt actually has approximately 1,400 Americans who were casualties or veterans of American wars all the way up until the Vietnam War. There was recently this beautiful Memorial Day ceremony that I had the opportunity to participate in, and they placed flags at all of the markers that were in the cemetery honoring these veterans. And they held a small ceremony early that Saturday morning. And it's an annual program. So the next section that I want to get into is just some of the myths that you may or may not have heard about the Holt Cemetery. So the first one is, as I mentioned earlier, the city of New Orleans, they do not have large staff members. And one of the things that people assume is that the grave diggers who work in the cemetery are actually paid staff of the city of New Orleans. So when you get a burial done at the city of New Orleans, you go into the cemetery's office and you pay the city the fee that for the burial, and then you contract a grave digger who is not a staff member or employee of the city of New Orleans. All of the grave diggers at Holt Cemetery are actually independent operators. They all work independently, so you will be working with this grave digger to make sure that the area is prepared for your family. Another myth, and this myth isn't just for Holt Cemetery, but also some other cemeteries I've actually heard this about very recently, that after the funerals, the grave diggers take the caskets and they reuse them for new burials. So that is actually false. Grave diggers and staff members at Holt do not remove the caskets after funerals. That mound that you see on the photo here is actually placed on top of the caskets to encourage the caskets to sink. So they are not going to attempt to pull that back out. They want that casket to sink in the ground. As I mentioned earlier, there are approximately 5 burials at Holt Cemetery per week. Each one of these burials is done by the grave diggers by hand. They do not have any heavy equipment or machines in there to dig out and prepare these grave sites. So when grave diggers are notified of an upcoming burial, they actually walk around the cemetery grounds and they probe the cemetery for an opening. So if those caskets, if they put that probe in the ground and they fill a casket, that burial is not going to take place there. They're going to look for an opening with an unmarked grave to actually prepare a new burial site. Once they locate the opening, as I mentioned, all of the burial sites are prepared by hand. On any given day, you can see a grave digger in Holt Cemetery hand digging a grave. Now, after a rainy day, as I mentioned earlier, the water table in New Orleans is very high. So as soon as the grave digger gets it dug up, then you'll have the thing filling up with water. And so he's trying to prepare the grave site to actually receive the body in the casket. And all of this is done by hand. And here's a photo of, water building up in the cemetery. This was after actually a rainy day at Holt. The grave sites, like I mentioned earlier, can fill up very quickly with water prior to a funeral. So once the casket is placed in the prepared location, the burial site is backfilled like that mound to encourage the sinking. And one of the reasons why you don't want to be in Holt Cemetery around this thing is because the sinking will happen at any given moment. There's no way to predict when that sinking is going to happen in the ground. So it's probably a bad idea if you see a fresh grave site to walk around it, because you never know when that sinking is going to take place in New Orleans. And I have seen it a lot with tour groups, and then also with just individuals just walking through the cemetery around these new burials. Another misconception about the Holt Cemetery is just that all of the burials are only African Americans and their descendants. And that's actually false as well. Early records that are found at the City of New Orleans archives in a cemetery indicate burials that are of individuals who are not African Americans. So there are people, the Holt Cemetery, the burials are just not like, as some people say, the poor African Americans who live in the city. So as I just mentioned, people say that, all of the burials are just for people from New Orleans only. Like, I first assumed that, like, people who are getting buried at Holt Cemetery are native New Orleanians, lifelong folks who have lived here forever. That's actually not true. When you look through the burial records at Holt Cemetery, you will see that there are people who are buried there that are from all over the United States and cities other than New Orleans. So there are some records of folks who are from Donaldsonville and other parts of the country who were actually buried at Holt. And then the other one is that Holt Cemetery is actually like a potter's field. Like, it continues to be a potter's field and indentured cemetery. This is where, like, these folks go. And remember, early in the presentation, I mentioned to you guys that Holt Cemetery stopped being an indentured cemetery in 1967. All of those burials are taking place in New Orleans East behind Rest Haven Cemetery. And then the last one this is the one that really frustrates me the most, is just that when people say, oh, Holt Cemetery, that's a poor people cemetery. I don't want to hear anything about a poor people cemetery. That's only for the people who are uninsured, or just like, they're just buried there because they didn't have any money. And that's false. I consider Holt as a family-centered cemetery. Many descendants choose to be buried near their ancestors. I'm one of those people. If I I can have my wish whenever I die, like 130 something years from now, I want to be buried at Holt Cemetery so that I can be near my second and third great grandmother, so I can be near relatives. It's not that I'm poor, uninsured, or anything like that. I just want to be near family. I want to be near my ancestors. And then the other one is, there are no burial records for Holt Cemetery. Well, that's not exactly true either. Holt Cemetery does have like several logbooks of burials starting in 1950 to the present. And then there are some gaps that are, of course, caused by natural disasters and just other personnel issues, but there are some records of burials. So I'm going to get a sip of water and then talk to you a little bit about like genealogy research at the Holt Cemetery. So, yeah, I think I'm going to do the questions at the end so that way I can answer them. Okay. So there are two primary places that you can actually conduct cemetery research for Holt Cemetery. So that's at the cemetery office. You could get information there by calling, and also the New Orleans Public Library. So before you can even begin contacting the Holt Cemetery office, or even in the case of the New Orleans Public Library, you need to know the date of burial and the place of burial. Throughout this process, and even as late as this weekend, I've had folks to tell me, oh, my great-grandmother is actually buried at Holt, and then I would help them locate the obituary and then find out they're actually not buried at Holt. So one of the things that you want to do, and of course, as genealogists, you guys know this, you need to actually confirm the burials, and you could do that in one of two ways. One is the obituary, such as my second great-grandfather, Alex Jefferson. It shows at the bottom he's actually buried at Holt Cemetery. And then also with the death certificate. So this is actually his sister, Mariah Harrell, and it indicates that she's also buried at Holt Cemetery. So you want to check for both of these things prior to researching at the New Orleans Public Library or prior to contacting the cemetery office. So as I mentioned, the Holt Cemetery office does have this set of logbooks, and that's actually a photo of some of the logbooks that's at the cemetery office. These logbooks only have information for burials that took place after 1950. All of the earlier records are actually kept at the New Orleans Public Library. So I did a little chart for you guys so you can see which years and months actually are located, that they actually have data inside of a logbook at the New Orleans. Sorry, my thoughts are getting twisted. Back up again now. So I did a little chart for you guys to see which months and which dates that they actually have information on at the Holt Cemetery office. And some of the years you can see that there are some gaps, there are some incomplete records, but for the most part, this is pretty good for a city that has faced multiple natural disasters and turnover of staff. As you guys can see from the history of Holt, it bounced around through multiple departments. And now recently, within the past few decades, we finally got superintendents who can actually manage the cemetery and also the cemetery records. So from 2011 and present, you actually have digital and hard copies of cemetery records for burials. And there's one thing that I forgot to mention on the website at the end of the public forums. I'm actually going to post a link to a genealogy resource guide for Holt Cemetery. And if you register for this presentation, you'll receive a copy of it, and it'll include all of these dates in that resource guide, along with other information. So in these logbooks, they are similar to any other debt records that you receive at a cemetery office. It has the dates, the names, permit number, place of death, sex, race, and age. It also has the undertaker, including lot and sections, and some of the books also have a plot location. So one of the things that you guys should know about the Holt Cemetery records, they were all manually done prior to 2011, and that information that was entered into the logbooks varied based on the person who was entering it. So for some decades and some years, you have complete location, including the plot location, and then some years you don't have any of that at all. So this is what the logbooks look like at Holt Cemetery. And this bottom line right here is actually for my grandma Florence, who I just mentioned earlier. So it shows that the burial, the funeral director was Joe Geddes, and she's buried in Section C at Holt Cemetery. So it does give you some information that you can use to try to find the area where your ancestors are buried. The Holt Cemetery office also has 6 cabinets of lot records, and this system was created in the 1970s by Clementine Bean. I want to tell her thank you for doing this, because it's a really neat system. It has like all of the burial records by plot locations. So remember I told you guys the burials all took place on top of each other. This was Clementine's way of tracking, okay, so who's neighbors in this plot number? Like you could actually see who's buried there from 1970s with your grandparents, your great-grandparents, aunties, and uncles. So it's really cool to see that, especially since the cemetery is very old, and to have something like this is meaningful. So if you contact the cemetery's office, I can tell you that, one, I'm super proud to have spent so much time there with Emily Ford, looking at these records. She has a lot of work ahead of her. This is actually one of the books, y'all. It was damaged in Hurricane Katrina, sitting in water. As genealogists, I know everybody's like, it was wet, but Emily has this book in her possession now, but because of this and the other books, she has to spend a lot of time stabilizing the collection before she can allow the public access to the records. So if you contact the cemetery's office, they will provide you a section and date of burial for the deceased if available. They will not send documents or scans of records. And simply, like I said, because they're trying to stabilize the collection. Here's another one of the books. And if you look closely at this image here, you can see the condition that these books are in. But you can still see the data from the books. You can still access the information, but all of the pages and everything, they're very fragile. So just briefly, I'm going to show you guys what's available at the City of New Orleans Archives Division. Their records are available on microfilm, but you have to contact the New Orleans Public Library to make an appointment to access them. But FYI, I've been hanging out at the Public Library main office. I love the appointment system, by the way. You ever had like a full like archive to yourself? It's amazing. I only had like 3 other people in there max working with me in the archive. So that was amazing. So to access the city's archives website, you go to archives.nolalibrary.org. And then once you're there, you would actually click on, you'll see this section that says genealogy. You'll see guide to genealogical materials, biography, obituary index. So once you click on guide to genealogical materials, you'll actually click on burial records. Once you're there, you're going to click on municipal cemeteries, because remember, Holt is managed by the City of New Orleans. And then once you're there, you can scroll down and you'll actually see like the full listing. It's like an index system at the New Orleans Public Library. So you'll see some of the same things that you would have seen if you went to the cemetery office. Same types of books, they're just scanned on microfilm. And this is pretty much their collection. So they have interments of 1881. And then they also have some stuff from 1901 to 1953. But remember, I told you guys, even though there is information out there, it just depends on who put it into the system. So the first thing I would do, if you have burials or you think that you have burials in Holt Cemetery, is check the year and then check it against that genealogy resource guide to see if that record, if it's a possibility that that record exists. Now, I can't tell you from the genealogy resource guide, like, oh yeah, there's going to be full information there. that may not be the case. Now, I can say in this section here, the burials between 1901 and 1953, especially as you get into the 50s and beyond, the information is just, there's more information on the 53 stuff than the earlier stuff. So it's just, well, all of it is just hit or miss. And as you can tell, I had a lot of ancestors buried there, and it just really depends on when they were buried. And so one other section that I want to get into is just a lot of people think because it's Holt Cemetery, you can't quite locate the grave sections and lots because of the way that the cemetery is laid out. So the grave diggers, as I mentioned before, they're not staff members of the city of New Orleans. These people, all of the grave diggers at the cemetery were actually trained by previous grave diggers. So the information was passed down orally instead of written down. So, and it really depends on grave diggers in terms of the layout and counting of graves, but it can be done. And everything that the grave diggers did in terms of location, section location, and just like the rows was by line of sight. So if you look at Holt as this big like rectangle, it's pretty much split up by that ditch that runs through the middle of it. And then it's divided up into sections between section A and then all the way to section EF. As you can see, section D just kind of like runs along that back wall. EF is like this little weird section that's over to the side here. E is over here along the front of the cemetery right next to the shade. And then A is the first section that you get to. And this is what Holt Cemetery looks like on the Google map. So as you can see, this is the ditch running through. And then that's all of your graves in section D, kind of like behind there. Here's our section A and section B, C, so forth. And then here's our E and then our EF system. And if you stand in the middle of Holt Cemetery, in any of the rows, if you just look carefully, you can see there are some rows. There are some, I will call it organization to the chaos that you first see when you walk in. You can clearly see rows at Holt Cemetery. And then what you have to do, if you're lucky enough to find a grave or plot number for your ancestor, you can kind of like get the grave numbers from the chart. Once you have the grave and site number, the plot number, you can actually begin counting the graves. So last Saturday when I did this presentation for the New Orleans Public Library, I connected with the great videographer and a person who does like a lot of documentaries. His name is Leonard Smith. And Leonard and I are going to try to create a video so that you guys can watch us count out graves in Holt Cemetery, because we felt that would be easier for me to do with the video than to try to show you on the screen. So the last thing I wanted to tell you guys about, just to be mindful of your time, is the Holt Cemetery Public Forums. Again, as genealogists, I would really love it if you guys can participate, because I know you have a passion for history and genealogy and preservation. So we're actually seeking individuals that have relatives buried in Holt or family members associated with Holt, or just people like yourselves who are interested in research and preservation at Holt Cemetery. Our objective is to bring together descendants of a deceased, family historians, scholars, genealogists, preservationists, just any interested parties who are interested in preserving Holt Cemetery. And during these public forums, we want to discuss ways to preserve the cultural heritage of Holt. We actually have a public forum taking place tomorrow via Zoom on Friday, July 16th at 11 a.m. We also have another one on Saturday, July 17th at 11 a.m. And all these times are Central Standard Times, by the way. And then we'll have the last one taking place on Thursday, July 22nd at 6 p.m. If you are unable to attend on any of these days, please connect with me. I still want to get your input on the Holt Cemetery. And you can register for these public forums at ourmammies.com/Holt. And I've reached the end. And I'm going to back up a second and see if I can answer any questions that folks may have, Yael. And I can't see the chat, so if you can read them to me. But yeah, it's going to be a little challenging for me to do it.
I'll state it again. All guests, please feel free to place any questions that you may have in the chat, or even raise your hand using the raise your hand feature here in Zoom, and we will ask those questions for you, or either unmute you so you can ask the question and converse with Gaynell regarding your inquiry. But I do kind of want to go back to one of the questions that I posed earlier, as for the reason that the grave diggers were independently hired, as opposed to having an association that would be responsible for all of these individuals and responsible for this cemetery as this is their job. I mean, what happens when there's not really much interest in becoming a grave digger?
Yeah.
I'm sure there will be, of course, but what happens if?
Right. That's a really interesting question, Yael. And it's certainly something that I thought of as well. Especially with the passing of the knowledge, it's City of New Orleans government. That's all. That's the best way I can answer it, because as I showed you guys earlier, I mean, there's not a lot of staff members at the Holt Cemetery, and I mean, even though you have some maintenance guys there who are keeping the grass cut as best they can, it's not a large staff. There isn't like someone who said, "Hey, this is my main job to dig the graves at Holt Cemetery. This is my cemetery. I'm going to maintain it, dig the graves in." That just doesn't exist. And it could be budget issues. I'm more than sure it is. But I can't really answer. I can't explain that, because all I can say is this pretty much is City of New Orleans government. There's a lot of departments that run that way, to my understanding. So, but it's something we should definitely discuss in public forums, of just the role of the grave diggers and how you pay them, because you don't pay them through the City of New Orleans. You actually pay the grave diggers through themselves. You don't pay them through like the cemetery. They're independently owned and operated.
All right. DeMille James, and I do apologize if I am not pronouncing your name correctly, wants to know, are there any plans for services or volunteer projects to clean the headstones and the markers?
Listen, you're speaking my language. I'm all ready for that. And I'm hoping that we can, as we talk about cemetery maintenance, and Yael knows we're always ready to put some rubber boots on and go and clean. And there are many days I have to talk Yael out of a cemetery because she's there doing stuff. But yeah, all I can say is keep your make sure that I have your contact information, and I do if you register for this, and I'll keep you abreast. And then also attend the public forums. But out of these public forums, we hope to find a group of like-minded people who can work together to help preserve Holt Cemetery. So yes, I would love it. I have cleaned thousands of headstones at Chalmette Cemetery, and I don't know, and my kids have actually cleaned tons of cemetery headstones in the cemetery. So yeah, I'm all for that. Please stay in touch.
And while you say that, yes, let's get the kids involved. And Mr. Leonard Smith III actually just mentioned that there was a summer program that hired students to assist with that. He was one of those students who actually assisted with those projects. So there are plenty of individuals, especially kids. They get them started early. They would love that type of work.
Yeah, and we talk about that all the time too. Like, you know how people always assume that because of genealogy, it's not like, you know, for the kids because you're visiting a cemetery. Well, kids don't like that. Get them involved early. My kids have spent a lot of vacations built around visiting a specific cemetery. But yeah, we need to get the kids involved in it. I just haven't connected with you yet, but you know, we need to talk. We have a lot of work to do in Holt Cemetery, and after these public forums, I look forward to I got my boots ready, Leonard. They're clean and they're ready to get dirty. So anyone who's willing to do it, let's get started. Let's schedule some time after the public forums to get things going.
I Another quick question. So you also mentioned the cutting of the grass. Do you all, and I know in some cemeteries, they do use persons who are incarcerated to clean up the cemeteries. I'm not sure if that's if that is a project that is there, but also using like some of the animals. I've seen goats go out and do and help, with, of course, they want to eat the grass to help do some of that type of work. So do you have any persons who may have animals like that could assist with that? Say if you find a day to do a cleanup project and enclose them in a gate to kind of assist. It's corny, but it works.
Yeah, it does work. In fact, but I'm laughing because New Orleans has a serious grass problem overall. There are tons of lots in New Orleans that are still overgrown post Katrina. Even within my own block, there are probably lots that are about 10 to 12 feet. And I'm pretty sure that the cemetery has thought of all of these things. In fact, I do recall a conversation that I've had with Emily about this specific issue. But yeah, I will definitely pose that as a suggestion. And I hope that we could discuss it some more at the public forums. But yeah, we may need to look at alternatives to maintain the cemetery. I do say this though. I do see some family members who are out there quite often cleaning their areas, and they come with their equipment to make sure that was done. Like on an earlier slide, you saw a descendant of the Hine family who, and I'm going to click back to it, she was actually cleaning the area for her family section. They have an entire section. And they often, it's here, they often come out and clean and rake and pick up trash and make sure that area is maintained. But again, because staff is limited, it takes equipment and, volunteers projects require management and having the staff to do that as well. So it's one of those things that I think that we could get into a more in-depth conversation. In fact, it's a major portion of the public forums is to talk about maintenance at the cemeteries because it's important. It's a discussion that we need to have. And even if we, through the local chapter, just create a group where we just go and visit and clean and maintain cemeteries, that may be something that we need to look into and getting resources to help us with that.
Another question, how many log books does Holt have, and what are your thoughts on digitizing them?
I have talked with Emily about digitizing the collection. I just know that it's going to take time, and all of you in the industry know digitization projects are very expensive. I was like, yeah, they're very expensive. And it does require a lot of time and dedication to get those done. And as far as administration of the cemetery, it's just 2 people. And one person is constantly getting phone calls for burials. And then the other person is trying to maintain 7 cemeteries. And some of those cemeteries that I named, they're very, they're tourist destinations. So just imagine a number of phone calls coming in, asking questions about certain cemeteries and just trying to maintain that with 2 people primarily on the administrative side. So yes, but digitization and stabilizing the collection and creating greater public access is definitely something that she's interested in and that she wants to do, right? But it's just getting it done. So I would love to talk about that more in the forums. So yes, creating access for the public.
Just one quickly, also mentioning off of that with giving some internships to the students that may be able to assist with digitizing, but also the maintenance of the facility. And depending upon how many cemetery projects are completed, I do know that there are entities that are willing to pay to get those services done. Ancestry is one of them. One of the only drawbacks with that is you got to make sure that they're not coming. The information is not coming out of, let's say, books that have copyrights on them. So since these don't do that, well, having copyrights on them, then I do know that they are looking to fund some projects. So that definitely may be a good avenue.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we could definitely discuss, especially as it relates to Holt. And then you guys saw images of those books. Um, I'm just, really grateful that they survived that long. But I think it's something that we should definitely discuss, just like overall preservation of the records and just some of the grave markers as well. Just an entire conversation around preservation and just resources that can assist. But yes, I do agree. That's actually great.
I love how you're always here. You're in my head, and I mean yours. That's gonna be my next question as far as preservation. So a lot of preservation, yes, it deals with maintenance, but for the graves that are, well, one of the issues that Holt does not have, hopefully does not have, in other areas where they're above ground, there are broken tombs and broken graves, and you're looking at people that you should not be looking at because they're deceased. But as far as the records that have not been properly kept, that information where individuals are being buried is being housed, in the memories of some of the older grave diggers. And you mentioned that good old rod, that a lot of, that old school way of prodding. And so what is being done to get with or even interview some of the older grave diggers who no longer say working in this business, they can come together and try to provide information as to who's where just from their memory.
And that's the thing. So that has happened. It's happening now. There's a neighborhood story project, a local nonprofit. It has been speaking with the grave diggers. It's kind of interesting that you said that. But yeah, that I know that there are some oral histories of grave diggers. There's one guy who has been doing it for a very long time. I do believe that Neighborhood Story Project is going to reach out to him as well. But I do agree. And then just not even the grave diggers, but just even people who have memories of Holt Cemeteries in earlier decades, right? Like, it's kind of funny when I contacted my mom trying to figure out where Mama Bell was buried because they didn't purchase a headstone for her. She literally told me she's under a big tree. Well, at one point in time, Holt Cemetery had tons and tons of those big trees. So, but even just the time that I spent with my parents in Holt Cemetery, and it was so funny for them to be on those grounds and how they recalled being there. It's funny, Leonard. Yeah, he said his dad told him the same thing, like he's under a big tree. So, but just hearing my mom talk about Holt Cemetery and just her memories of it and just going there for so many burials for so many years, that's important too, because, a lot of them are also passing away. Like, a lot of those folks who remember those early burials are into their 70s, 80s, and even 90s now. So, as genealogists, we want to preserve their history as well. So yeah, it just sounds like a gigantic oral history project to me. That I see your mind. Like, should we do this? Yeah, but it's a very important place, and it's like one, it's one of many burial grounds where, like I said, you feel the family love there. You see people tending to those grave sites, and like you said, it does have the broken headstones, right? Like, it does have the sinking headstones as well, where the headstones, like you said, the in-ground burials, we have the war table, they're sinking in the ground. So just having volunteer groups to help us realign them and straighten them out a little bit and clean, as you mentioned earlier, would be amazing. And I think that's a conversation, once again, and I hate to keep pushing the public forums, but that's the space where I really want to sit down and get all of our ideas together, organize our thoughts, and then bring them back to the cemetery office and the city and say, hey, this is what the preservationists are saying, that this is what the families want. Because right now, I forgot to mention, there are also tour groups who actually go through the cemetery right now. And, if you think about it, and you have these headstones that are unstable, and you have groups kind of like moving all around in the cemetery, how do the descendants feel about that as well? So I want to be able to have that conversation, open and honest, as Gaynell lives by the brutal truth, and begin to talk about that. Like, and it may be, Yael, that may be a discussion that we need to have overall. Like, how do we feel about tourism at the cemeteries, especially when, for example, organizations who may be, their heart may or may not be in the right place, and they're charging a lot of money to visit these cemeteries, but yet the cemeteries need the resources for preservation projects, for oral history projects. So it's one of those conversations I would love to have and just kind of like gather our thoughts so that we can speak as one voice and say, hey, this is what this place needs. This is what this place deserves. So that's why I keep trying to invite you guys over and over again, nudging you like, please stand up, be a voice for your ancestors, come to these public forums and let's get the ball rolling. Let's get the conversation going in the right place at the right time.
So as far as the public forum goes, what is the most immediate thing that you need outside of just public voices? What do you need that you can take right now and say, okay, we're going to utilize this?
Public voices. That's the strongest resource I have right now. Hey, cousin, that's the strongest resource I have right now. Because all of us and all of the historians, all of us preservationists, even our interpreters, our reenactors, we need to preserve the spaces and places that tell our histories, even those uncomfortable spaces and places, because this is the thing that's here that reminds us that our ancestors were here, and this is the thing that reminds us of like what they contributed, and this is not what they deserve. So let's restore it all back to Holt. Let's make Holt what it should be. So I need voices. I need opinions, even unpopular opinions, right? Like that's the beautiful thing about all of us. We come from different places. We have different lived experiences. And it's important for us to share our honest opinion and share your feelings. This is what I feel. This is what I think. Because I've had conversations about like tourism and all that stuff. And I'm like, I'm okay with some of it, but to a degree, it hurts me when I see that I have a very old headstone that I have seen, and I'm not saying that it's all groups, but it hurts to see somebody who struggled to pay for a headstone for their ancestor and then seeing someone else walk over it and with the possibility of breaking it. And you may be out of town and you can't get back to the cemetery, and then you come back 2-3 years later, 5 years later, and no headstone and or either a new headstone for somebody else. So even the fact that it's an active cemetery, just having a conversation about that as well. It's a very active cemetery, 5 burials per week. That's active for an old cemetery that's already, it was full since when? So it's just, important that we begin to have this conversation. And that's the great thing about forums and virtual presentations like this, is to begin to talk about it. Let's talk about it. Let's air out our feelings and discuss what's going on with these places.
So down the road, what is the probability of, getting, say, the GPRs to locate, you already know, to locate some of the spaces that are being used in order for, I guess, to do a little marker commemoration to these individuals? Nothing expensive, but something that you may be able to put, okay, we know certain individuals, we know for your four placements here. So let's put just a little simple marker there that may just identify that person, just to say, okay, well, we recognize that individual and they're not lost to time.
And I agree with you, but I think it's a matter of how we do that. And I'm not the right person to make that decision. I think at this point, anything is possible. I know that post my last presentation, a lot of folks have contacted me because they realized, oh my goodness, I haven't been to the cemetery. Can I get a marker now? And I'm like, is this something that we want to do? And how do we do it? Remember, y'all, the cemetery is full. And the place that you may want to put it may already have 4 or 5 things there. So just having a discussion around that starting tomorrow is going to be very interesting, because people may have different opinions about that, right? Like, How do we do that in a place where no one owns any of the land? No, so it's a tough one, and that's what the staff at the cemetery have to deal with. Just those tough decisions, and like I said, still a very active cemetery. 5 burials a week. There was 2 burials last Saturday, same time, happening at Holt Cemetery.
Wow. All right.
And this is 2021 in New Orleans. And as you can tell, the task committee said, hey, in 1990s, we need a new cemetery. Long before Hurricane Katrina hit. We need a new cemetery. 1980. We need a new cemetery. We kept saying that. So as descendants, how does this make us feel? Like, what do we want for this space? How should we preserve it? What should we do? And that's the conversation I want to begin to have tomorrow, because I think we need to have a unified voice. We need to come up with the action plan, because this is 2021. Somebody else may be doing this presentation in 2041 talking about the cemetery is full. It's overfilled. I mean, we keep adding to it. And there are veterans buried there.
The question. So, okay, so with the monies that are being paid for the burials, where do all of those funds go? And is anyone willing to part with, say, a 5% percentage of and donate to a fund to assist with this project? I mean, something as 5% is not that much, in my opinion, but
well, the money to the gravediggers, they're independent contractors. So
I guess the money to be buried in that space.
Well, that's actually being sent to the city. Remember, it's a city. It's for the city government. So like even with the federal government, with any monies coming in, it just goes into the budget. We can't say like, oh, give me 20% of that. But it's nothing saying that we couldn't start an independent organization to raise funds for the cemetery, to support preservation work in the cemetery, to help maintain what's there.
So would you be able to go to, say, City Hall and talk to the representatives and the politicians there, just to even put it on the agenda to try to get?
I mean, I think I would feel more comfortable doing that if we were an independent organization and I say, hey, I'm here with the descendants group for Holt Cemetery and this is what we feel. But as an individual, I mean, just think about it. We just survived the pandemic. So, the first thing they're going to hit is budget shortfalls. We can't even begin to have that conversation. Especially since, again, there's only 2 people working in the cemetery office. Just 2. And the city superintendent, the cemetery superintendent is maintaining 7 cemeteries for the city. And some of them are hot tourist destinations. And so even maintaining the ones that are hot tourist destinations and making sure that people are treating those as respectful places can almost be a full-time job, especially when you have multiple groups coming in. It's challenging, yeah. All I can say is, again, speak to the power of the voice and putting together this and just remaining vigilant and staying on top of it. Because you know what happens if you turn in a report and you don't put action behind it, it's just going to be paperwork.
All right. Those were the questions. I don't see any others in the chat box or that I've even thought of. So
yeah. Well, I'm going to advance this slide to one. Yeah, we could tag team it. I'm going to encourage you to become a member of the Louisiana chapter. It's exciting to have a chapter. Like, how long have we wanted a chapter here?
For a couple of years, and we've now officially made a year old. This has been our baby for the longest, and we're ever excited to be able to have this opportunity to even present this to Louisiana. It is an amazing feat. It is long overdue. You can't have American history without Louisiana history, so that mind boggles me as to why this never even transpired to begin with. But nonetheless, it is here now. And we have wonderful charter members. We have wonderful members who join us and for every program, whether that's on one of Gaynell's programs or one of my programs, or even something that's outside of the state but still relative to Louisiana. We want to make sure that we're bringing a wealth of good information and research, because that's what we are. We're historians, we're genealogists, and we're researchers. We want to make sure that everything we bring is of that quality, of that scholarly quality, but still having fun with it at the very, very same time. So the information that you see on the screen now, it just shows the dues. The annual dues for nationals is $45. And for the local chapter dues, it's just $15. Now, one does have to be a member of the national chapter in order to be a member of the local chapter. But every chapter within itself has its own programming and have its own events. And so it's not a silo, but every chapter in every state and every city, we all have our own go-tos and our own programs that we provide. And so we want to be able to continue to do that and continue to actually build and get as many individuals both in Louisiana and outside of Louisiana, still have those ties to come in and join us. And maybe you all can be part of the next program, put your own program on an event. We'll definitely love to have you all. So, all right. Okay, now anything else? So any donation that anyone wants to provide is greatly appreciated. And that way, so when you do become members, we can send out welcoming gifts to those. We don't want you just to join the chapter and say, oh, well, all they gave me was a hide. No, we want to be able to send you something to say that, hey, we welcome you with open arms, and just to say thank you. So again, all donations are appreciated, because a lot of times us as historians, we do get asked to do a lot of work. And sometimes it takes a lot that we may not always necessarily have, but with the chapter funds, we can always pull through and provide the wealth of information to whether individuals are looking for information, or if we're looking to book other speakers to be facilitators for different programs. So please donate to the chapter, but definitely to Gaynell. She has done an amazing job in all of her work. Absolutely.
Thank you.
She's my go-to all the time. So please feel free to donate. And if no one else has any questions or comments or concerns, again, I'll let you go ahead and close out. My wonderful VP.
Okay. Thank you all for coming again. I don't know if I can, host. You have to.
Oh. Okay. Sorry, y'all. Okay. Information again is to reach us is in the chat box, and we greatly thank everyone for attending tonight. And what time is the public forum on tomorrow?
11 o'clock.
11 o'clock Central Standard Time. 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, because I don't want to be late. All right. Okay, everyone. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.